Thank you very much.
I remember in my presentation, I did talk about maybe a body that could be focusing on space policy and helping countries develop their own national legislation. You know, a body like that would help us to know to have this information offhand quickly, because they will know which countries doing what, when, how, and be able to coordinate those efforts.
So I think you're taking me directly into the next question, which we have, asking whether we think the African Union will be able to regulate space activities in Africa, right? What are your thoughts? Do you think the African Union can do this? Do you think they can set up a committee to do this? Do you think perhaps our regional organizations like ECOWAS, SADC, the AMU, you know, what are your thoughts?
Where there's a will, there's a way. I think it takes the willpower of governments. Governments have to be aware of these benefits and want to reap from this. And I can't say that the African Union can do this alone. It's going to need the states to want to help to see this through. The African Union on its own, it has no power to push things alone. It will need the state. But there's a lot of work that has been done already with the space policy and the space strategy to get countries to be able to just sit down and do that on its own is an achievement. So that shows that there is a direction and possibly a way for us to do this.
Any other contributions on that?
If I may just add one thing, I agree. I think regulating at the level of the African Union would mean a transfer of competency and sovereignty, which is not the case. But I think the African Union and probably the African Space Agency will have a role in the coordination. And I think it's key to ensure that, to help first the countries, because it's quite difficult to draft the legislation and understand all these issues. So they will have a role to do this. And then so that there is a global coordination, and at the continent level, there are consistent legislations all across Africa. So I think they have a real role in doing this.
There's another question here about what specific laws, if any of you can talk about, within the states that you're familiar with exist and what they actually cover when it comes to space activities. The person is saying they're aware of maybe the communications sector and the fact that we know there's a link between communications and what happens in space, but do we have any other laws outside of telecommunications that affect, direct activity in Africa right now? I know Julia mentioned things like maybe the remote sensing or,
Yes.
helping with what those kinds of activities. Are there any specific activities like that that are being regulated on the continent? So
I'll just touch on in terms of Nigeria, and those who are more familiar with Nigerian law, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But Nigeria, and I think there might be one other country, might actually be Rwanda. For example, their space laws, for example, provide that all, I know Nigeria says all satellite data and all satellite images must be, a copy must essentially be given to a central repository of the country, which I think is a fantastic initiative, and not all countries have that. It's important that if we're allowing foreign entities to occupy this sector, that we at the very least, if we are not in control of that data, we at least are guaranteed access to it. So that's one other area where there is some law. But as I said in my talk, there's no overarching comprehensive law dealing with a multitude of aspects of space. And there are not specific laws, for example, dealing with Earth observation or remote sensing or space weather, etc.
So it looks like that's an area where we can spend some time, building some regulations to help those who are interested in functioning within those categories to have a framework within which they can operate. The other question that has come is whether you are aware of any national laws in Africa in the space sector that do not align with international law or maybe the regional treaties related to space. And this is very similar to what we've talked about on, the concept of maybe space being for the benefit of mankind, the usage of space for the benefit of mankind, just opposed to the economic benefits that individual states are trying to reap because they've invested, right? So there's a little bit of a conflict there. Are you aware of any conflicts, such conflicts for African states and international law or conventions?
Not at the moment, no. I can't think of any conflict because maybe because we haven't developed that much in space. Maybe that conflict will arise in the future. But for now, I don't know.
There's a question whether why none of the African states have adopted the Space Equipment Protocol to the Cape Town Convention 2001, facilitating the finance and lease of space objects. The aircraft protocol has proven to be very successful in Ethiopia and other African countries. Is there no need for a similar uniform international regime in Africa? This matter seems to be hardly ever addressed. This is a very interesting question. They want to know why no African states have adopted the Space Equipment Protocol to the Cape Town Convention. And this is about equipment facilitating the finance and lease of space objects.
Sorry, I thought there was one country who signed, maybe I'm wrong, I should double check. I thought there was one African country that signed the, so the Cape Town, the Space Protocol to the Cape Town Convention aims at facilitating the financing by taking security over space assets, like it's done with aircraft. And this has been adopted now nearly 10 years ago. And there was a lot of discussions because at the time, the industry believed that it wouldn't work. And a few countries signed the protocol, but it's not been ratified, and it needs, I think, 7 or 8 ratification to enter into force. So it's not in force, and it won't be enforced in the very near future, although I believe there is a rationale for it. But I thought there was one country, one African country, I should double check, that signed it. But even though it's not in force, so even if it was signed, it wouldn't be in force. But I remember, because I was part of the discussions when it was adopted. And I remember that there were a lot of African countries present, very active, because they believed that this could be a key element for the development. Because the idea behind this is that if you can take security over space assets, then that would enable companies to raise financing and facilitate the development of space assets. So it would be a very interesting tool if it was in place.
Thank you.
I think a quick search, if I'm correct, or if the source is correct, I think it may have been Burkina Faso.
Yeah.
Burkina Faso and maybe Zimbabwe, but I need to do my research on that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude and Julia. There's a question on insurance, right? So are there any insurance companies that you're aware of operating on the continent that provide insurance services for the space sector specifically? Because it's a niche area, right? We have a lot of insurance companies in general. And are you aware of any that are dedicated solely to space related insurance on the continent? And if so, where are they or who are they?
I mean, even in South Africa, where the developments are really, really that good, there are not insurance companies that are specifically looking at space. You'll find that for a company that wants to manufacture a satellite, for instance, the insurer might insure one piece of that satellite and another piece differently, but not the whole satellite at a go. And then because of the expenses involved, the insurers prefer to separate these pieces, and not only separate the pieces, but separate also the liability concerns. When you can have one project that is insured by 3 different insurance companies, just so that they can split that liability. So there is not one insurance company that specifically looks at the insurance of space objects in South Africa that I know of.
No, I think, and I think the space market, as you said, is very narrow because there are not that many projects. It's huge amounts, and it's a global market. So it's usually international insurance companies. There are a few that are specialized in this area, like, just to name one, Marsh are doing this, and they are coordinating these aspects. But I think it's a global market, and it's becoming more and more difficult to insure because of the risks involved, and so that there will be less and less insurers willing to enter into this market.
There's a question about the considerations that are impacting the creation of legal or regulatory regimes within African countries. What do you think are the biggest barriers right now when it comes to the creation of comprehensive legal regimes? What is standing in the way?
Awareness. You need people to be aware of what you're doing in order to have buy-in. Many stakeholders are not aware of what's going on, and they're not aware of the benefits to start with. And then you have the competing interests. You have people asking you, why do we need to regulate space when we are having problems here on Earth? So you have to justify those things. And this goes to showing people, to show that people don't understand and have no information on the ground of what space really is. Still today, people are still wondering, you are a space lawyer, what exactly do you do? You see? So it's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I fully agree. And if I may add one thing, I think there is they don't see the need to regulate the sector because it works. Even if you don't have a space law, you can have space activities. You have a lot of countries. Tunisia has just launched a satellite made in Tunisia, completely made in Tunisia a few months ago. And there is no space law, so that can work. So why do we need a space law? Because that can work without. So that's difficult to explain.
I think related to that is that there's a need, not just for public awareness on the news, that's one thing, but there really needs to be a public education exercise. We need to explain to the farmer how a satellite can improve his crops by 40% or 80% or 100%, how a satellite can show which land is fertile, which land is not, when there's going to be, a flood, or when, how deforestation is happening, or when there's overfishing, so the fisherman knows, about his catch. So we need to give practical examples as to how space affects our everyday life. And then once, as Icho says, we have that buy-in from the public, there will be an impetus for legislators perhaps to put together some legislation. But the problem there is, even if we have the buy-in, in my view, there is not significant capacity on the continent in terms of policymakers, policy advisors, legal counsel who understand the nuance of space law, and not just international space law and domestic space law, but how it interrelates with a lot of other areas of law. And that's important when states either go to negotiate on the international level or when they're trying to draft their domestic law. There's no point drafting a domestic law if it doesn't cover and deal with the issues that could possibly arise that we're trying to avoid.
I think that takes us back to the question of somebody who asked which laws go hand in hand with space. And as you've just spoken, you can see it cuts across every law. It cuts across the environmental side, cuts across the space and security law, it cuts across everything. It's just that you have to find the relevance and the alignment in that area.
It even cuts across criminal law. There was a case in the States, you guys can Google it, where an astronaut in outer space accessed her bank account online, and there was some issue about fraud, you know, with her ex-partner or what have you. How do you legislate for activities that are being conducted outer space? I mean, can you charge somebody with something if it's not happening in your jurisdiction? If they access the bank account from outer space rather than from land? So these are some of the issues that, you know, it does raise issues. I mean, that's a very extreme example, but it demonstrates, as Icho said, it's very cross-cutting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to move to the last question that we have from our participants, and then our panelists can share their closing remarks before, you know, we end this roundtable. There's a question here that says, space law appears to limit disputes to informal resolution provisions in the United Nations Charter. Is there any possibility of the AU, a member state, or the African agency seeking the equivalent of an injunction against one of the larger players, for example, Europe, USA, China, or Russia, in order to prevent potential harm, damage, or an infringement of the treaty obligations, or to seek an interpretation, for example, on the global commons? And what would be the appropriate forum and procedure? So this is a long question, and it's touching on, I guess, everything space and how we will resolve disputes in that sector.
That's an absolutely fantastic question. Just to touch on the first part about, I think they said something about dispute resolution being informal or something to that extent. I have actually published a paper on my suggestion of incorporating non-compliance procedures into space law. So that would be another way of minimizing potential space disputes. So if that's something that you're interested, you can look for that paper. Now, in terms of some kind of global injunction, I think that's a great idea. How practical, I think would be very difficult, but if anybody is willing to try it, I will be their #1 fan, that's for sure.
But it also goes to say, like, if you have the national space laws, then you can still apply your own national laws to regulate whatever event happens between you and that developed space actor. So it's important and imperative that people do have space laws in their country so that these issues can still be dealt with from the national point instead of going to the international side.
A good example would be, I think a few years ago, we've seen recently on the news, the Chinese debris that re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and all the brouhaha that's caused. A few years ago, there was a similar scenario which had space debris land in Ivory Coast. I don't recall that being on the news half as much, but it's in all our interests. It's a global interest that these sorts of things don't happen, because we've been very lucky so far that there hasn't been any significant harm to persons or property from the re-entry of space debris or space materials. But if there's going to be more space activity, which it very much looks like that's the case, and we're not in a position where we can 100% control re-entry to Earth and where it's going to land, if we don't have a controlled re-entry, then yes, perhaps, you know, we have to say it is in a global public interest to ensure that debris is not falling left, right, and center. And how can we, who has a right to protect that interest? Who is charged with protecting that global interest?
We must also remember that we have the Liability Act that regulates such incidents. And if anything from space were to happen to the Earth's surface and damage and harm people, then we can resort to the Liability Act, and states can take their claims to the Commission. And
if they are ratified.
Yes, if they've ratified the act, yes.
But the problem arises if they haven't.
Yeah, yeah.
I agree. I mean, the Chinese incident was mentioned. I also remember there was a crash between two satellites, one American and one Russian. It was probably 10 or 15 years ago, and we didn't see any liability issue. All this is managed, diplomatically, and at some point this will have to change to have probably rights to challenge this and have a proper way of recovering claims, or at least filing claims.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists for participating, for sharing their knowledge, and for being so open to answering the questions that the participants and our viewers brought up during the discussion. I will ask that you provide some closing remarks, to bring this roundtable discussion to an end. Any recommendations or thoughts that you'd like to share with us before we close off today?
I would say let's educate Africans. Let's educate ourselves about space. We need countries to take a more proactive step to bring awareness of the benefits of space to the African nations. The space is it's a platform that can help Africa out of the economic situation that it finds itself in. It's something that we should take advantage of, and we can only do that if our people are aware of what's going on and the regulations that we want to put in place. So, and the AU has done a lot so far with the policies and the strategies, but they need to do more in educating, in facilitating, and ensuring that these countries, the African countries, are able to enact these laws and have proper national laws that speak to the space, to space law in line with international obligations. Thank you.
Yeah, no, for me, I was very interested in the discussions we had with Icho and Julia. And I think what comes out of this for me is very positive in terms of development, of course, of the space activity, but also of the role of the regulation. And I think the regulation will be key in this development. We are, of course, probably more aware than others of this aspect, but at least we share this view. And I think it's also our role to spread this message, make sure it's understood by, of course, the people who will make the decision makers, but also at all levels. And you mentioned the farmers, etc. I think everybody has to understand that space is, we cannot live without space now, and this is probably the best message we can spread around.
I would just end by saying that I think it's important that as Africa is putting together or implementing their policies and strategies and domestic law, we don't simply, cut and paste or mimic exactly what's done abroad. There's a lot of good precedent. And a lot of the hard work has already been done. But I think that individually, each nation needs to take a long, hard look at the state of their nation, what their needs are, and tailor their legislation and their space activities to the needs of their country.
Thank you very much to all our three panelists for joining us today and giving us your time, right? Looking at the supervision of space activities by African countries, right, in Africa. And I think your thoughts and ideas have been very well received, and we're looking forward to the next step in the discussion. And we're hoping to see more action from the states themselves in collaboration with the AU and maybe our regional organizations to just build up our space capability and also develop appropriate and comprehensive regulatory and a legal regime to facilitate Africa's reliance on space as we move forward into the next century. So thank you once more.